Good evening, everybody. My name is Ted Huskins. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Lake Union. I've been in that role since July. Prior to that, I was Executive Secretary of the Atlantic Union. So it's a pleasure to be here with you at Proximity, and I pray that God will bless you this evening. You should have gotten a lifesaver when you came in today. If you got it, just hold on to it for right now. If you ate it already, well, we'll have to talk afterwards. So anyway, hold on to it. Let's pray together. God, as we come to you this evening, I pray that you would speak through me, help me to hide behind your cross, that Jesus might be uplifted, for we pray it in his name. Amen. There's a quote that's one of my favorites. It says, "We have nothing to fear for the future except we forget the way God has led us in the past." So in honor of that sentiment, we're going to go on a bit of a time travel this evening. So I want you to fire up your DeLoreans, turn on your flux capacitors, and we are going to travel back in time over 200 years to the coast of Ireland. And in your mind, I want you to picture this house that you see and imagine that you're there 200 years ago. And inside you find a single mother and her only child, who is about 12 years old. The husband, the boy's father, has died, leaving these two alone in the world and nearly destitute. The mother has done everything she could to provide for her son. His name is Samuel, but there's never enough. Never enough to eat. They are always on the edge of complete and total failure. And the boy is not like other boys. He can't run like other boys. He can't play like other boys. He can't work like other boys because one of his legs is shorter than the other. No one will hire him to do odd jobs, and as you can imagine, he feels inferior. He's very self-conscious. There's only one place where Samuel felt normal, one place where he could excel, and that was in the water. Because in the water he can swim, and it doesn't matter that one leg is shorter than the other. In the water, his leg creates no challenges. And so at every opportunity, he makes his way to the seaside. Eventually, even the rough seas along the western coast of Ireland, known as the Wild Atlantic Way, weren't even frightening to him. He excelled. He became an amazing swimmer. And one evening, over a very meager meal of watery porridge, his mother said, "My son, my boy, there's a ship at the dock. In the morning, that ship is going to sail for America. My son, you must be on that ship because I can no longer take care of you. We have no more food. I have no opportunity to make money. And so tonight you must go and get on that ship and go to America. And in America, you will make something of yourself. You will be successful. You will make a life. You will be a gentleman. But above all, my son, I want you to remember to love God and to love people." And so that night, Samuel snuck down to the docks, and when the watchman fell asleep, he slipped aboard the ship and hid himself beneath some tarps and cargo in the hold of the ship. All he had with him was a small jug of water and a crust of bread. Several days into the journey, he needed water. He was starving. He had no option but to present himself to the crew But he did so knowing that they were far enough into the journey that they wouldn't turn the ship around. When he presented himself to the crew, they took him to the first mate, who struck him in the face and cursed him, and he said, "Boy, I'll teach you to sneak onto my ship. You're going to work like a dog while you're on this ship. You're going to do everything that nobody else wants to do." And so that's what Samuel did. He swabbed the deck. He cleaned the vomit of seasick passengers. He did all the jobs that the crew didn't want to do. And they told him that when he got to America, he would be sold into slavery. He would be an indentured servant. There was one thing aboard ship that gave Samuel joy. On that ship was a young couple, husband and wife, and they had a little 2-year-old. The couple was very seasick. They were struggling on the voyage through the rough waters. And in his free time, Samuel took care of the little 2-year-old. It became his little buddy. As the parents tried to recover from their seasickness, even just to have a moment alone, Samuel would take care of his little buddy. They became inseparable. As the ship neared the coast of America, a hurricane whipped up out of the Caribbean. The winds, the waves were too much for the ship. It became apparent that the ship was going to sink. Samuel made his way to the deck. He looked off into the distance, and he could see a small strip of sandy beach way in the distance. And he said to himself, "I cannot perish on this ship, because I have to honor my mother's request that I make something of myself." He said, "But I'm not going to perish, because I'm a great swimmer, and I will survive. I will get there. I know I will." And as the ship started to capsize, Samuel jumped off the deck and into the deep, cold water of the Atlantic Ocean. He went down for what seemed like an eternity, and another eternity coming back up. Finally, his head pierced the surface of the water, and he gulped in deep lungfuls of air. Samuel looked, and as he bobbed on the waves, he could see that thin strip of sandy beach. And he said, "I'm going to make it. I'm going to swim. I'm going to make it." And in that moment, beside him, another little head pierced the surface. It was his little buddy, the little 2-year-old that he had spent countless hours playing with aboard ship. And Samuel was faced with a decision. He could save himself. He knew he could. Or he could try to save this child, realizing that the chances that both of them would die was very great. What should he do? What would you do? Samuel was not the first individual to be faced with such a dilemma, and he certainly wasn't the last. I grew up in North Carolina, a culture of oral tradition and stories. I grew up in Appalachia. And one of the things that North Carolina is famous for is for its seacoast, the Outer Banks. It's famous for the Lost Colony, Blackbeard the pirate. But the Outer Banks, everybody knows the Outer Banks. Maybe you've seen bumper stickers on cars that say OBX for Outer Banks. It's noted for its wide sandy beaches and the seemingly calm sea that sets you at ease until you realize that danger lurks beneath. Because the Outer Banks have always been known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. The sandbars lay in wait for ships, and hundreds of ships have sunk off the coast of North Carolina. It's the graveyard of the Atlantic. I knew that all of my growing up years, and I thought that North Carolina was the only graveyard of the Atlantic until I moved to New England. And there I encountered the rough seas, the rocky coasts of New England. And I realized that New England is also known as a ship's graveyard. And just like the Outer Banks of North Carolina, hundreds and hundreds of ships have sunk off the coast of Cape Cod in Massachusetts, off the coast of Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maine. Near Penobscot Bay in Maine, I found this tombstone in a cemetery overlooking the ocean. It says Henry Norton, age 26, lost at sea. Very typical for that rocky coast and those rough waters. Lots of people all up and down the eastern seaboard were lost at sea and died victims of wind and waves. And at first, nobody was doing anything about it. Because you see, in the 16 and 1700s, the sea was everything to America. It was our commerce. It was the internet of the day. It was AI of the day. It was cutting-edge technology to sail the seas and make your fortune there. And a lot of people were losing their lives, and no one was doing anything about it. When a ship went down, there was no one to organize a rescue party, no one willing to help those who were perishing. Finally, a group of common, ordinary people just couldn't take it any longer. And they decided they had to do something. They had to do something about the graveyard of the Atlantic. They first organized in the state of Massachusetts, but quickly spread to Rhode Island and Maine, and then all the way down through Maryland, Delaware, into the Carolinas, all the way to Florida. They were just volunteers, but they had a passion and a desire to rescue those who were perishing. They were volunteers from all walks of life who dedicated themselves to saving the victims of shipwrecks. When wind and waves conspired to kill those who dared to sail upon the sea, these men and women of the lifesavers left the comfort of their home and they entered the fray. With nothing more than wooden boats and cork life jackets, they set out to save those who were sinking beneath the waves. They were called storm fighters, storm warriors, and finally they were known as the lifesavers of the Humane Society. They donated their money to build life-saving stations, to purchase boats and life preservers, food and water and medicine, because they could not bear to watch people die. They worked tirelessly and with uncommon valor to save those who were the victims of shipwrecks. They practiced and they trained so that they could use the surf boats effectively. Their task wasn't easy. And many of these lifesavers became victims themselves. Finally, the life-saving service spread west, all around Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, and Lake Erie. In Michigan alone, there were over 30 life-saving stations. This one is Sleeping Bear Point. Hold on. This one is Sleeping Bear Point, life-saving station in Glen Haven, Michigan. It's now a maritime museum. But you know, they even, these people of the life-saving stations, they even developed a mission statement. They developed their own mission statement. And that mission statement says, hold on, I'm having some technical challenge. I apologize. Their mission statement says, you have to go out. You don't have to come back. You have to go out. You don't have to come back. But then something crazy kind of happened. Something crazy kind of happened. The U.S. government started funding them. And in 1915, the U.S. Life-Saving Station joined the U.S. Cutter Service and formed the United States Coast Guard. Now there were professionals who were paid and trained to save people who were dying in shipwrecks. But here's the really crazy thing. The people of the life-saving service continued to meet. They would meet in the life-saving station. They would have covered dinners and potlucks, and they would sit around and they would reminisce about what it was like when they actually saved people. But they just didn't go out anymore because they lost their mission. They lost their mission. They fellowshiped, they told stories about the good old days when they used to save people, but they quit doing it. They said, there are professionals who will do that. We don't have to do it. But they continued to meet. They continued to meet because they had lost their mission. They didn't go out anymore, but they continued to meet for years until the last children of members who actually went out died. And the life-saving stations, most of them are abandoned today. Some of them, like the one up in Glen Haven, is a museum. Others have become restaurants and even homes. But the life-saving service is a thing of the past. Friends, I want to share something with you this evening. I believe that God has called you to be a lifesaver. God has called you to be a lifesaver. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, but also to the Greek." God has called you to be a lifesaver. I want to tell you again about Samuel. Samuel had a choice to make: save himself or try to save his little buddy. Again, I ask you, what would you do? In a second, Samuel had to decide. And that quick, he decided he was going to save his little buddy. He grabbed his little buddy and hugged him to his chest, and Samuel rolled onto his back, and he floated. And he rode the waves hour after hour. The waves would go over them, but still he would hang on to his little buddy, until finally, near dusk, they washed up onto the sandy beach. There was an old fisherman out there who was collecting the debris from the shipwreck and looking to see if anybody would survive. And he saw these two children wash up onto the beach. And he ran over to where they were, and they were struggling for air, and they were cold, and they were in desperate situation. He took them over to his little fishing hut. He gave them some soup to drink. He stoked the fire and warmed them up and wrapped them in blankets. And he helped them to recover. The next morning, he went into the small fishing village there in that little coastal community, and he told the people of the town, he said, 2 children survived the ship. They're the only ones who survived. It's amazing. A boy and his little small buddy. The fisherman said, "I'm too old to raise children. Would some of you parents come and adopt these children?" And so several couples went down to the fishing village, or to the fisherman's hut. And immediately a couple that could not have children took the 2-year-old, thinking to themselves, you know what, we can raise this child just like it's our own. They'll never know the difference. We'll take this child home. The other couples looked at Samuel. They looked at him. He was bedraggled. His clothing was obviously, even after a night in the sea, the clothing of a very poor person. And one leg was shorter than the other. Nobody wanted him. Nobody took him. And so then a wealthy farmer in the area learned about Samuel, and he thought, you know what, maybe I'll get a hired hand out of this. And so he went and he looked at Samuel and he said, "Boy, can you work?" And Samuel said, "Yes, sir, I can work." And the man said, "Well, you're going to be my indentured servant. You're not going to be my son. Let's just be clear about this. I'm going to take you home with me. I'll have a place for you to live. I'll make sure you're fed and that you have clothes to wear. But for 7 years, you're going to be my servant. And then you'll get your freedom." And so Samuel had no other options. That's what he did. And for 7 years, he worked hard to prove himself of value to this farmer. In fact, he was such a hard worker and so valuable, at the end of 7 years, the man said, "How about staying on? I'll pay you a wage now. You're free, but I'll pay you if you work. And you can even grow a garden on the side and sell your produce in town." And so Samuel did it. He worked for a wage for 7 more years. And he saved everything he got. And finally, he had enough money to buy a little farm with a rundown farmhouse and a broken down barn. But he was a great businessman. He was a hard worker. And he turned that farm into something great. And he kept buying more land, and he kept buying more horses, more tools, better methods of farming, until he was one of the most successful farmers in that area. But there was one thing that Samuel did not have. He had no wife. He was lonely. He would go to church, but wouldn't dare speak to the girls in church. He felt inferior. He was shy. He wouldn't dare go to dances. My goodness, with his leg, he was sure no woman would want to marry him. One day, Samuel had a wagon load of produce to take into town, and he hitched up his beautiful matched pair of horses and began the long journey. It was a hot, dusty day, and by mid-afternoon, he was nearing town, but his horses were thirsty. And he stopped at a farm, and there was a well near the house, and by the well was the most beautiful woman Samuel had ever seen in his whole life. She was just drop-dead gorgeous. He couldn't even bring himself to speak to her, but he knew his horses needed water. So finally he said, "Can I pump some water from your well for my horses?" And the young woman, her name was Mary, she said, "No, but I'll pump it for you." Kind of reminds me a little bit of a story in Genesis. And so she pumped some water for the horses, and she gave Samuel a cup of water too. And they chatted for a few minutes. And then Samuel was on his way. But he found himself looking for excuses to go to town. And he found himself looking for excuses to stop at that same farm and water his horses. And he also found that when he was going to town that he would take a bath, and he would comb his hair, and he would clean himself up, and he would make sure that his horses' tails were braided and that they had on their best bridles and their harnesses were polished. And he always stopped to water his horses. And Mary, she found herself gazing out the window down that dusty dirt road, hoping that this kind young man with beautiful horses would stop to water them. And so as he stopped time after time, they talked more and more. But she finally realized that Samuel was far too shy to ever take things a step further. And so one day, after he had watered his horses and he was getting back onto the wagon to go into town, She said, Samuel, would you stop back by the house after you go into town? My parents would like to invite you for supper. And Samuel smiled and he said, absolutely, I'd love to. And so he stopped back by the house on the way back home, and he met her parents, and they talked, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon a wedding was planned. The wedding was held in the parlor of the farmhouse there of Mary's parents. They were the Fergusons. And after the wedding, Mary's father came to Samuel and he said, Samuel, I need to talk to you in private. There's something I need to tell you about your wife. I was afraid to tell you before you were married. I was afraid maybe that you would change your mind. He said, come into the bedroom. And so Samuel followed his new father-in-law into the bedroom. And his father said, Samuel, you need to know that Mary is not our daughter. In fact, 18 years ago, she washed up onto the sandy beach, the victim of a shipwreck. She was saved by a little boy who saved her life. They were the only survivors. But she's not our daughter. And Samuel looked at his father-in-law and he said, I am the boy. He said, I am the boy. He never knew that by saving his little buddy, he was saving his future wife. He never knew how his own life would be changed by that one decision in the ocean. This couple went on to have a daughter named Polly. And Polly had 10 children who had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And their names are all in my family tree. In Matthew 16:25, it says, for whoever will save his life shall lose it, and whoever will lose his life for my sake will find it. And so, friends, I want to tell you this evening that you are called to be a lifesaver. You never know the person that you may save and how that person may change your life. God is calling you this evening to dedicate your life to Him, to be a lifesaver. You see, He gave His life for you, and out of gratitude, He's asking you to be willing to give your life back to Him. And so I want you to take the lifesaver that I gave you, and I want you to hang on to it. Put it on your mirror, put it on the remote control to your TV, put it on your computer, put it where you'll see it every day. Tape it to the center of your steering wheel maybe. Wherever you'll see it, put it there. And when you see it, say to yourself, God is calling me to be a lifesaver. God has given me a mission. You have to go out. You don't have to come back. That's your mission. You have to go out. You don't have to come back. As Matthew 16:25 says, for whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. When you decide to be a lifesaver, open the packet and eat the lifesaver.